I know it's only Tuesday. We went to watch the Blue Angels this afternoon, and it was their practice round, and that meant less traffic. Same thing, got to see the same thing, so we had a good time, and it's going to be really hot tomorrow, I think. Hotter than today, so we had a nice time. And tonight what we're going to be dealing with is an overview of the books of Judges and Ruth, and my goal is that by the end of June, we're going to get all the way to the Psalms. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that, but I'm going to be sandwiching some books together. For instance, 1st, 2nd Samuel, technically in the Hebrew text, is one book, not two. And we're going to kind of move a little bit quicker. And tonight we're going to go through Judges and Ruth together. And I think putting those two together is really, really good because same time period, and the emphasis of the books is significantly different. One's very negative and one's very positive. And so we're going to look at those two things together. So let's go ahead and start out with a word of prayer tonight, and then we will dig into our overview of Judges and then move into overview of Ruth. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for the opportunity to study your word tonight. And I pray that as we have opportunity to look into these texts, that you would give us clarity of mind and bless the discussions we may have tonight. Give us safety. Give safety to those who maybe are traveling, if there are any still. And I pray that this would just be a blessing to everyone. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so we are looking at the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. And if you have your notes there, you're going to see a couple of things under introduction. I can't remember if I gave you this information, but under the introduction, I want to give you a couple of things to think about as we dig into this. First of all, the book of Judges stands in contrast to Joshua. And Joshua, an obedient people, have conquered the land. Now, it is true, by the end of the book, they had not been totally obedient, but as a general whole, they were. In Judges, they are disobedient. They are involved in idolatry. They are repeatedly being oppressed by their enemies. And so when we talk about the title of the book of Judges, the Hebrew title basically is translated Judges. That's where we get our name from. And it carries the idea not just of someone who settles disputes, but this is someone who was a deliverer. So when the Bible talks about him raising up a judge, the judge was not just someone who was going to mediate disputes and that kind of a thing, but he was going to be like a national hero. And I say he, there was also one woman who was a national hero in there as well, Deborah. And so God would raise up this person. It would bring some stability to the land, and then that person would die, and then they'd go through this cycle again. The events that we read about in this book cover a little over 300 years. So right around 350 years is what we're talking about. So it's a lengthy period of time. And some of the judges overlapped each other. When we talk about the flow of the book, you'll get to see a little bit of that, and I'll get into that in just a second. So let me give you kind of an overview of the flow of the book and how it works. And by the way, we don't really know who the author was. Some believe that it was Samuel or one of the prophets who would have been schooled under him. And I believe that the Jewish tradition says that it was Samuel. So we'll go with that. More than likely. We know it's the Holy Spirit, ultimately, who gave us the word. But here's how the book flows. There are 3 parts to the book. The first part is Israel failing to obey and maintain purity. And in this section, the first 3 chapters, we have each tribe mentioned and their failure to take the land that God had given them. And then after we see each tribe highlighted in their failure to do what God had told them to do, we see the painful consequences of their disobedience. And this is really the primary theme of the book. Israel does not obey. There are consequences. They're humbled. God brings a deliverer. There's established stability. And then the cycle repeats itself over and over and over again for 350 years. So we're talking about almost the same amount of time that the nation of Israel was enslaved in Egypt, just to kind of put that into perspective, okay? So it's a lengthy period of time. We're talking about a lot of generations. We're talking about a longer period of time than the United States has even been a nation, to put it into perspective. okay? We're going back almost all the way to the Reformation, to put it in those words. And then the second part of the book is Israel's up and down history. And I believe there are 7 cycles that are mentioned in the book, off the top of my head. I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me. But basically, he deals with this regionally. So in the first section, he gives the southern campaign. In the second section, a northern campaign. This is where Deborah and Barak are in the story. Then a central campaign, and then an eastern campaign with Jephthah, and we know about Jephthah's vow. We're not going to really get into that tonight, but that is a big question sometimes people have. And then a second northern campaign, and then lastly a western campaign, and this is Samson. So some of the most prominent characters in the book are going to be people like Gideon and Samson, and then Deborah and Barak. Those are kind of your most prominent people that are in there. And this isn't necessarily written in a chronological order, not saying that there isn't a chronological side to this, but he's mostly emphasizing the regions. God raises up someone in the south, he raises up someone in the north, someone in the central. And when we're talking about the western campaign, we're talking about Samson and the Philistines. And a lot of people don't realize this, but the Philistines actually had kind of a Greek ancestry. They were probably Phoenicians who came. I don't believe that the Philistines were actually in the land at the time of the conquest, but shortly thereafter is when they would have immigrated and taken over the area that is now the Gaza Strip, believe it or not. So just an interesting tidbit there. We could say more about that if we wanted to. All right, and then the third part is the nation's depravity. And he describes it in several different ways. So first of all, he talks about the idolatry of the people. Do you know the story of the man who decided to start his own religious system? I mean, it's a really bizarre story. But why do we see that in the book of Judges? It's to say, here is God's people. They're supposed to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a peculiar treasure, and they're fully involved, engrossed in idolatry. And then he goes from idolatry to their immorality. They are a very promiscuous culture. And we know the story of the concubine who was brutalized and led to basically the nation having an internal struggle of civil war. And the nation almost wiped out all of the Benjamites because of this horrific incident. Now, when we read these kinds of things in the Bible, they're not the things we teach our kids in Sunday school. Okay? We talk about Samson, but a lot of times we don't go into the great detail. You go, well, why did God put those things in the Bible? There's terrible stories. He's making a point that this is the people. These were the godliest people in the land, okay? And they were going after the gods and the terrible values of the people, and then because of this idolatry and the immorality, they became a very violent people, and they were literally at each other in civil war. So the emphasis is this is a nation that is not functioning the way that it's supposed to. So that kind of gives you the flow of the book. Those 3 parts, those 3 sections are there. So let me give you a purpose statement for Judges. Judges presents a 300, and I know it's not exactly 300, I'm rounding that, okay? It's about 350 years. About a 300-year cycle of sin, discipline, deliverance from Israel's history to demonstrate the consequences of disobedience, God's faithfulness to his covenant as he graciously raises up, delivers, and preserves his people, connecting the time of Joshua to the future monarchy. Okay? So that's really what we're doing. We're looking at this period of time from the land being conquered, 350 years of chaos, and then God brings Samuel, who's at the end of the Judges, and Saul and David are going to establish the kingdom and rule it as kings. There are a couple of very important concepts that I want to talk about tonight from the book. One of the things that I have here is God demonstrates the consequences of disobedience to God's faithfulness and his faithfulness to the covenant. There are two covenants that are mentioned in the Old Testament in relation to Israel. Can you remember what those two covenants are? Nat, go ahead. Abrahamic covenant. What's the other one? Go ahead. Mosaic covenant. Excellent. All right. Now, can you guys remember the difference between the Mosaic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant? Go ahead.
The Mosaic covenant was one of them was unconditional. One of them was conditional.
Okay, you're right. We want to get the two straightened out, which one is which. But good job for remembering that. So, the Abrahamic covenant is an unconditional covenant. Okay, so for instance, when we go to Genesis 12, and we go to Genesis 15, God says, Abraham, I'm going to make of you a great nation, and I'm going to give you the land of Canaan. Okay, then after that, he says, I'm going to bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And in you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, in that statement, he doesn't say, I'm going to bless those who bless you when you're doing well, and curse those who curse you when you're doing bad. He doesn't say that. He just says, I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. And I know on a Sunday night, we had the issue of Amalek, and I know that that's a story that makes us a little uncomfortable when we think about what was going on there. But, I mean, really at the heart of that story is, here is a people group that had so little regard for God's laws and God's presence that they were continually tormenting the Jewish people. And not only that, but they were doing it in some of the worst ways possible. They were going after the most vulnerable. They were going after the women, the children, the elderly. They were not going and fighting a military against military kind of conflict. And that really plays into why God dealt so harshly with those people. But what we're going to see in the book is that God is going to be faithful to that covenant. How do we know that? In spite of all the ups and downs, God continued to preserve the people. And he continued to preserve a remnant. And one of the reasons that God would fight for Israel is because this is the one place in the entire world, other than the natural revelation where we see there's a creator through the creation, where God is speaking directly to people, and he's giving them the scriptures, and he's telling them how to worship. So if the nations around destroy the nation of Israel, then God's communication to mankind is gone, okay? And his plan of redemption is gone. He's going to preserve his people. So we see the Abrahamic covenant. But then we see the second, and that's the Mosaic covenant, and this is the conditional covenant. And the statement that should resonate with us is he says, I set before you this day life and death, blessing and cursing. So choose life, okay? Well, what was the condition? The condition was, if you will obey my laws and you will follow me as my people, you will experience blessing in the land that I've given you. And if you don't, then you're going to experience the consequence, okay? So what we're seeing is we're seeing both God's faithfulness to both covenants. Abrahamic, he preserves the people. Mosaic, when the people are disobedient, then what does God do? He chastens them. He disciplines them. He punishes them. He allows their enemies to rise up against them. But interestingly, when those nations rise up against Israel, God's going to deal with them because they are evil in their intent. So we could almost say it like this. God isn't put into the heart of the Philistines to be evil. That's what's there. God protects the nation of Israel and keeps the Philistines in check when Israel is obeying him. But when they're not, what does God do? He allows them to step in and confront them and persecute them and trouble them. And when Israel's humbled and they turn to God, what does God do? He raises up a deliverer, and then he punishes the Philistines. Okay? So that's the idea of what's going on there. We see his faithfulness to Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants. Any questions there before we go to the next thing? Yeah, go ahead.
I always heard there's a Davidic covenant.
There is a Davidic covenant too. Yeah, there is. But up to this point in the Old Testament, these are the covenants. Yeah, but yes, the Davidic covenant obviously most definitely is there, and that was given when David wanted to build the temple, and then God said, "No, you can't." He says, David, you want to build me a house? I'm going to build you a house, and your son's going to build a house for me. But I don't need a house because I'm the God who is over everything. So anyway, but yes, you're correct about that. There's also a new covenant as well that's talked about in the prophetic books, and all of these covenants are pointing forward to the fulfillment in Christ. So the next concept, the generational cycle of apostasy. Now, I don't know if you remember this when we were talking in the book of Deuteronomy, but one of the things that I spent a lot of time on was the importance of passing on the faith to the next generation. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 6, he talks about we're to love the Lord with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then we're to teach these things to our children and our children's children when we go up and down and walking in the way in all these places. And the idea is that our job as parents is to pass on the truth to the next generation and to model it so that they grab a hold of it and they embrace it. Well, to be very frank, there are almost no examples in the Bible of good families that passed on from generation to generation. Almost none. I hate to say that, but it's honestly true, okay? And so this is something, it is a struggle, unquestionably. Now, there are godly generations, but the vast majority of cases that we see are not passing on to the next generation. And one of the greatest illustrations of this is the book of Judges. We see this cycle of apostasy. So we start with a faithful generation. And this faithful generation's faithfulness, obviously these people are choosing to do what's right. But there's a reason that they are motivated. And the reason is because there is a leader. So like if you go back to the book of Joshua and we see how it ends, I'll read this to you just so that we can kind of catch this at the end of the book. I'm trying to think which chapter. Basically, I'll have to summarize it. Basically, what happens is it says that all of the people that lived through Joshua's generation and those who were the elders with Joshua during that time period, the people were faithful. But when those people were dead, they drifted. Okay, what's the point? Well, the point is that faithfulness is directly connected to godly leadership. Godly leadership doesn't make you do right, but godly leadership is a very important thing. I mean, when we look at times of prosperity, look at the book of Proverbs. It says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. And when the wicked are in authority, the people suffer immensely. Okay? What's the point? Well, those who lead you, they affect your lives. And there's a reason that people need to be shepherded, pastored. It's because we will drift without those looking out for our souls. And so when the nation had a leader who is faithful, there was stability. But no leader lives forever. In fact, the longest period of peace during that section that you're looking at in the Judges is about 40 years. So essentially my lifetime, that was the longest period of prosperity at any point in those 300 years. And why is that? Well, because after 40 years, whoever was leading the people was dead, and those who had been around them were dead, and now the people are doing what is right in their own eyes. And that's the statement we see repeated over and over and over again in Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then we see generational failure. A stable generation fails to effectively pass the faith on to the next generation. So, when this happens, you see this downward process of decay. I mean, we are in our own society right now. We are not Israel, okay? We are not God's covenant people of theocracy. That's not who we are. But there's no question that during the founding of this nation, it was heavily influenced by biblical values. And what we're seeing today is this massive decline of Christian values in America. And with that, we see a lot of chaos. We absolutely do. Because the principles that undergird a stable society are biblical in nature. And when this happened in Israel, it's because one generation didn't pass on the truth to the next generation. The third thing we see is chaos and judgment. When a generation turns away from God, there are natural and divine consequences. Now, when I use the word natural, what I'm saying is this. If God just left us to ourselves, you know what would happen? Things would fall apart. And to give you a good example, let's say that you have a house that no one is living in. Okay, nobody's living in it, and you leave it alone for, let's just say, 5 years. Now, nobody's been living in it to trash it, right? What's going to happen when you walk in that house? The door might fall off its hinges, and you're going to find mold is growing everywhere, and you're going to see stuff growing all over ground. And you say, well, why is that? Well, because if you leave something alone, it doesn't go toward more order. It goes toward disorder, okay? We call it entropy. That's what happens. So someone has to take care of a house in order for the house not to fall apart. Someone has to take care of a garden so it doesn't fall apart. Someone has to upkeep facilities and those kinds of things. So if God just left people to themselves and let this natural process unfold, there would be all kinds of chaos as a direct result of that. But there's an additional side to this. God is also judging his people. He's removing his hand of protection. He is enabling the people to face the consequences of their actions. And so, chaos and judgment. And you know what happens in chaos and judgment? People all of a sudden start looking at life simpler again. Much more simply, okay? They start realizing, wow, this is important and this is not important. Why is that? Well, because the basic essentials are now the only things that we're really caring about. And I mean, in some ways, this is what happened in our society when you had World War I, and then there was all this economic prosperity in the 20s, and then you have the bottom falls out of the markets, and the nation goes through a Great Depression. And the people that lived through the Great Depression, they realized the importance of saving and preparing for the future and all kinds of different things. And you know what? And then we went into World War II, and coming out of that was a time of great prosperity. And then guess what that prosperity led to? Decline. Why? Because people became very self-centered and very hedonistic. And so the same kind of thing goes on here. When God allows people to experience leanness and difficult times, it winnows the society, you might say, and it points them back to God, and it humbles them. And then what does God do? When there's repentance, he raises up a deliverer. When the people are humbled, they turn to God, and he responds in grace. You know the verse in James where it says that God resisteth the proud, and he giveth grace to the humble. And so this is the one of the biggest concepts in the book of Judges, where we see this constant flow from faithfulness, failure, chaos, repentance, deliverance, over and over and over again. And you know, one of the things that this actually should encourage us to recognize is that even though things seem a little bleak right now in our own society, like, you don't know when things turn. And the fact is, God could really get a hold of people's hearts and lives. And we could see him moving again in our society. You don't know what's going to happen. And he moves at times. And we see this example here in the book of Judges. I'm going to go to the next one, but I'll give you a chance for any questions or comments. Yeah, go ahead.
I grew up down south, and as a young man, a lot of my family was anti-government. And every time they would say,
Did any of them live through the Civil War?
when they'd say every man did what was right in his own eyes, I kind of picked up that was a good thing. Because of my some point I had to unlearn that.
Oh my, that's funny. Kind of. Yeah, well, and the point I think that's really being emphasized is there was no objective standard that was consistent in the society because people were not following the scriptures. And then on top of that, you didn't have leadership that was enforcing that. And that's what was going on. So that leadership gap led to a lot of chaos. And then the last concept, a stable generation. We should put that out there too. Stable generation and peace. The stability and faithfulness of a generation is nearly always directly connected to godly leadership. So when God raises up a deliverer, 20 years of peace, 30 years of peace, 40 years of peace, whatever it was, that's what you would see. And then we'd see the cycle continue. The last concept is God's grace. Israel was preserved entirely because God is gracious. This goes back to the Abrahamic covenant. He wasn't preserving them because they were righteous. He wasn't preserving them because they were perfect people. He was preserving them because of his grace. So that's what I have for the book of Judges. We're trying to move through a little bit quicker, and I want to get into Ruth next. I gave you a content outline, and the resource that I used for that is actually, it's an excellent resource. It's Nelson's complete book of Bible maps and charts. And I really like the way that it's laid out. It's a book that if you wanted to get something that'd be really helpful as a survey type thing, it gives you a lot of good information. So just wanted to mention that. Credit where credit is due. I didn't come up with that myself. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next section, which is an overview of Ruth. Now, when we talk about Judges, Judges is all about the failure of God's people. Failure, 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 failure. You know what Ruth is? It's about God's grace, but the faithfulness of a foreigner. Pretty amazing thing to think about. You know, sometimes when we read the Old Testament, we get in our minds that God was against the foreigner. God didn't love those who were Gentiles. That's not true at all. In fact, when we talk about God's judgment on the nations, it's always connected to idolatry, toward very evil, immoral practices, those kinds of things. But God's consistent. I mean, he punishes Israel when they do the same thing. So it's not about ethnicity, but it's about something very different. And the book of Ruth is a great example of this. Now, interestingly, when we talk about the story of Ruth, Ruth is a Moabite, and if you were to look at kind of the chart of family origin, Ruth's family would have come from Lot's side, and the story is not a good story, but the bottom line is that going all the way back, we're talking about the Jewish people and the Moabites essentially being cousins, okay, if you want to put it like that. And however, what we see is that the Moabites followed the practices of Lot's family. Lot's family lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and yes, God rescued Lot and his daughters from Sodom, but guess what? Lot thought like Sodom. A lot. And we see that because of the way he handled the situation with the angel of the Lord and those that were with him. And we see that his daughters commit this terrible sinful act that ultimately leads to the Moabites being born. And we see that that group of people followed in the pattern of not Abraham's side of the family, but Lot's side of the family, where they came from, they hailed from. So a couple of introductory thoughts, and then we'll get into the flow of the book. And I know I just preached on this the other week, so some of this will sound kind of familiar with you, especially if you took notes. All right, Ruth is a story of love, devotion, and redemption set in the distressing context of the period of the Judges. It presents a Moabite woman who forsakes her pagan heritage in order to cling to the people of Israel and to the God of Israel. Because of her faithfulness in the time of national faithlessness, God rewards her by giving her a new husband, a son, a privileged position in the ancestral line of David and Christ. Jewish tradition credits Samuel as the author, which is plausible since he did not die before David was anointed. However, it is true that David was not reigning as king when Samuel died. So the book doesn't say Samuel was the person God used, but some people say, well, he was dead when David became king. But he did actually anoint David to be king. So he could have written it. It's not necessary for him to have lived to see David sit on the throne to say that Ruth was part of the lineage of David. The flow of the book goes like this. It starts out with a faithless decision, and that faithless decision is Elimelech. And by the way, Elimelech means God is king, interestingly. Bethlehem is called the house of bread. So here's this man who says, my name is God is king. He's married to Naomi, whose name means pleasant, or she was a lovely person. And more than likely, Naomi was someone who was the kind of person that if you knew her, you'd say, what a sweet, wonderful lady. You like to be around this person. There's a reason that her daughter-in-laws loved her and wanted to go back to the land of Israel with her. It's because she was a sweet person. So it's almost like a play on words. It's almost ironic that here's this man who says God is king. He doubts God. He goes to Moab. He crosses over the Jordan River back to the land of Moab. And he leaves the house of bread to find bread in that foreign land. Then the second thing we see is how this decision culminates in unforeseen compromises, and this leads to great heartache. So initially, he's going to find bread, and then it says they stayed, and then they stayed 10 years, okay? So it doesn't appear when they originally are going that the plan is to stay there indefinitely or to stay there a long time. He just wants to get some food, and then once the famine's over, he goes back to the land of Israel. And also important to note is that the reason there's a famine in Israel is because of their disobedience. It's the time of the judges. But what he does not realize is that he's going to leave his wife and his two sons. They will all die, and the only one left will be his wife Naomi. And so he doesn't realize the heartache that awaits that family when they make this decision. It is a compromised decision, and it's not a good one. And then we see next how that heartache leads to a root of bitterness that was in Naomi's heart. And when I say a root of bitterness, it's really hard to be tough on Naomi. I mean, in this room, there are people who I know have experienced some really heavy issues in life. And the truth is, it takes a long time to work through what you've experienced. There's a lot of questions that you never get answered. And Naomi was a very broken person. And she was very, very weary. And so when she comes back to the land of Moab, she basically tells them, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. We know what Mara means because that's where the bitter waters were turned sweet when the nation of Israel was coming from the Red Sea. And she says, call me Mara, I'm bitter. God has dealt harshly with me. And we also see that when she's talking to her daughter-in-law, she says, go back. Perhaps you will find rest in the house of your husband. Why does she say that? Well, because she's a woman without a husband. And she feels the weight of that. So that bitterness affected her, and it affected her daughter-in-laws, and it affected the people that she came back and saw when she came back to Bethlehem. But despite these unnecessary compromises and these painful circumstances, Naomi's bitterness, God stayed faithful. And we really see this in verse 16 where Ruth says, do not entreat me to go back. And this is one of the most well-known statements in all of Ruth. She says, whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. And the next two statements are really, really important. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Now, it was not easy for a person to leave their culture, especially, we talk about hard times today. Folks, there's a reason that slavery was like predominant in every single society in human history up until we stopped it in our own culture. When people lived in the ancient world, if you were vulnerable, you had nothing. Your survival was on the line. Lots of people would have become servants or slaves simply to survive, or they would have been taken advantage of. And so for a widow to go live in a foreign land where people's morals and ethics were very different than what the Bible would teach was dangerous. That person was very vulnerable. But the land of Israel was different because God had laws to protect the vulnerable. Now, does that mean that the vulnerable were always protected in Israel? No. Because if the people were not following God's laws, then the vulnerable were vulnerable. But God had laws to protect widows. God had laws to protect fatherless children. God had laws to protect those who were strangers and foreigners. Do you realize even part of the Levitical tithe was to give to the foreigner, the stranger, the widow, the fatherless? You say, well, those were non-Jewish people. Yes, that's true. But God had a provision to protect them. They were coming to Israel because they believed that Israel's God was the one true God. And in many ways, when we talk about people moving to Israel during the times like this, like her statement, your people, your God, my God, that is actually a classic example of the function Israel was supposed to have. They were supposed to be a light to lighten the Gentiles. And through Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth were to be blessed. And so when Ruth is coming to Israel, the land of Israel, she's actually, you could say the land is in some ways inadvertently doing what it's supposed to do. Okay? But what do we see there? We see God's grace. Why does she want to go there? It's because she has seen something about Israel's God that is different. And maybe before Naomi was embittered, having lost her sons, maybe there was a season where she actually was a great testimony. I don't know. I mean, the text never tells us, but you'd have to think it was a possibility before she experienced these heartaches. Then we move to God's grace in their story to cause them to return. And I love in chapter 1, verses 22 and then to 2:1, it says that she heard in the land of Moab that God had visited his people. I love that little statement. Because what it's showing you is that God allowed her to come in contact with this information that was a catalyst to taking her back to the land of Moab. I don't know if you've experienced this in your life. I definitely have. You don't realize this until some time has gone by. But there's something that you go through, maybe a person just says, hey, you ever thought about trying this for work or something like that? And you never thought about it once in your life, and all of a sudden you're like, I'll give it a try. It becomes your career. or some a friend says, hey, have you ever thought about asking that girl out over there? And this guy's like, no, but all of a sudden, piqued his curiosity. The rest is history. Things like that. Little things, little opportunities, little statements. They seem so small and insignificant at the time. Yet what does God do? He takes those things and he uses them to accomplish great things. And so here's an example of this. Naomi hears in the land of Moab, God has visited his people. The way it's worded, she seems like she's so separated from them. They're his people. What about, they're her people too? But that's not the way that it's stated. And it's God's way of beginning to open the door to her going back. And that is going to be the beginning of the turn in the story. By the end of the story, God has provided a loving husband for Ruth, a nourisher of Naomi in her old age, preserved his redemptive plan through the birth of King David. You want to talk about an amazing end to the story? That's what it is. Now, I'm going to go back and get into some of these details a little bit more in a minute, but I want to give you a purpose statement. But before we do that, any questions before we jump into that? That kind of gives you the flow of the book. I know you kind of know the flow of the book. It's one of the easiest books. It's one of the shortest Old Testament books, so it's very easy to know the storyline. And it's kind of hard to preach it like in sections because they all go together. You got to kind of like get it all together. But anyway. All right, so purpose statement. Ruth teaches that God tenderly cares for people despite painful hardships by demonstrating his rich mercy through little details that work together to accomplish his grand purposes. All these little things are fitting together like pieces in a puzzle. And if you pull out each piece and you just set it on the table and look at it, it doesn't look like much. But when they all get put together and they're set in place, you step back and you see, wow, God was working in this story. And some of the individual pieces are very painful and they're sad, but they serve a purpose, a function in this story. It's all about God keeping his redemptive plan intact. So there's two major sections in the book. One is Ruth's love being demonstrated to her mother-in-law. And then the rest of the book, the other half of the book, is Ruth's love being rewarded. God is going to bless this woman who loves her mother-in-law. So let's look at a couple of the themes that are very comforting in this book. The first theme is that some of life's greatest hardships are not our own doing. I know I talked about this on Sunday. Some are, okay? There are a lot of things that we deal with in life that are not good, and the only person we can blame is ourselves. Lots of things like that. But not everything's like that. And it's hard for people to swallow their pride and say, yeah, I'm the reason that happened. It's really hard for people to wrap their minds around something like, this happened, and I didn't deserve that. This was wrong. This was unjust. God, why didn't you stop that? And what we see in this story is that Naomi experienced that kind of a thing. She lived in a chaotic time of the judges. Her husband makes a bad decision and takes her. She's lost, and she loses her husband. Her sons marry foreigners, so now, once her boys decide to marry Moabites, it doesn't seem like she's going to go back, right? I mean, they're establishing roots in Moab. And then her sons, they die. She's a widow. No children, no husband. She's in trouble. What is she going to do? Well, that shows you that sometimes the things we deal with in life are other people's choices. Sometimes our parents make bad choices. Sometimes our children make bad choices. Sometimes our boss makes bad choices. Sometimes our nation makes bad choices. And we have to live with the consequences of those things. But God can still work despite those things. Second theme, God never abandons us in these painful seasons. One of the great themes of the book of Judges is that even though you have all this chaos and all these ups and downs, God in his grace is continuing to work. This is the same thing we see in this book. This book is showing you that here is Naomi. She's not happy with God. She's bitter. She's broken. She's hurting. Ruth is she's a novice to the true faith, but God continues to work in their lives. And the next one we see, she's physically isolated. She has no one. She's consumed with what she's missed most. She's talking about how she doesn't have a husband. She laments her pain that she saw as God being harsh against her. And though she was isolated and could not see the evidence of God's grace, we see, in fact, he is being gracious. Third theme, God is rich in grace. That little statement, but Ruth clave unto her, is one of the most significant moments in the story, but also in the Bible. She says, no, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stay with you. And from that point on in the book, we're going to see how God's hand is at work. So, she's going to stay with Naomi, even though Naomi says, no, go. She comes during the time of the barley harvest. God raises up Boaz. In chapter 2, verse 1, it says, now Elimelech had a near kin. He was a mighty man of wealth. His name was Boaz. Interesting. What that's telling you is this guy's going to be important in the rest of the story. And mighty man of wealth, mighty man of valor is how we sometimes see this translated. The virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. This is all talking about the same thing. It's a person who is strong, they're wise, they're industrious, they make good choices. God's hand of favor and blessing is on them. That's who this guy, Boaz, is. He has great character. Ruth is randomly choosing to go into Boaz's field. She doesn't know who he is. She doesn't know people's names. She doesn't know their backgrounds. It's not like he had a sign on it and said, I'm Elimelech's near kin. Come on to my field and get you some grain and barley in my field. It wasn't like that. She just said, well, that looks like a field I'll go to today. And she goes in there. It was her hap. That's the way that it's stated. But it was God's providence. He was working in that situation. Every detail is coming together in a very special way, and they're witnesses to God's grace. And then the fourth thing, God's ways are far higher, far bigger than we perceive in the moment. There are certain things in our life that are so significant that don't seem like a big thing at the time. They don't at all. I remember when I was in high school, junior high school, if you had asked me in February, do you think God wants you to go in the ministry? I'd be like, never thought about it in my life. By the end of the baseball season, guess what? I wasn't thinking about ministry, but I was willing to do what God wanted me to do. And what was the difference? An injury in the middle of the season. That was the difference. And I remember when I was looking at going into missions, I was going in one direction. The Lord kind of shut that door through different circumstances. And my friend Micah Colbert, hey, what do you think about us working together in Ghana? I was like, okay, I'd be interested in thinking about that. Maybe God will open up an opportunity. I get a phone call from a guy who's heading up a trip to Ghana. He says, we need a guy on our team who can do the preaching because we don't have any guys to do the preaching. I was like, okay. He's like, would you be willing to do it? All right. I got to ask somebody if I can be let off my contract early because this is going to be shortly before. And I walked up to the guy's office, told him what was going on. He said, no problem. We'll accommodate you. I was like, wow. I mean, little things like that. Like at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal, but that's part of my story. That's how I ended up at Anchor. How I ended up in Ghana. All these different pieces together. The point is that in our lives, we have these things that happen, and we don't realize at the time what's going on. 22 years ago, Pastor Josh and I were wrestling on the college team. He was not even dating Becky at the time. I remember we were on a road trip, and we'd be out in the hallway reading our Bibles, doing devotions, and there's another guy, his name was Steve. And Steve's family's moving up here in a couple of weeks because he's in the military, just got stationed up here. I mean, that's 22 years ago. None of us would have ever dreamed, like, here we'd be, like, at Anchor Baptist Church and this and that. But that's the way God works. It's really a phenomenal thing. He doesn't just do this in the lives of people like Ruth and Naomi. He does it in your life too. And that's a lot to be thankful for. God's ways are bigger and higher than ours. So there was immediate comfort talked about in these verses. Blessed is the Lord which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman. But there's a bigger picture. Future glory. His name will be famous in Israel. Now, why would this Moabite widow who marries Boaz, who's like old enough to be her dad practically, not quite that old, but he's a good bit older than her, okay. How are they going to have a son who's going to be well known in Israel? Well, if it's King David's grandfather, well, maybe he will be. Okay, and that's what happened, King David's grandfather. And then there's an immediate and future. He's going to be unto thee a restorer of thy life and a nourisher of thine old age. Well, the fact is that here's this woman who's been broken by life and beaten down, and God's going to pour blessing into her life. But there's an even greater blessing coming down the road that she doesn't fully understand. Her son is going to be a part of the lineage of Christ. And Ruth is going to be in heaven because of a redeemer Naomi's going to be in heaven because of a Redeemer. And their lives are a part of that story. It's pretty amazing to think about. So, anyway. So, a couple of important concepts in this book. The first one is the concept of kinsman redeemer. Now, this is one of those little cultural tidbits that to us is kind of like, whoa, that's really out there. Like if I died, one of my relatives should marry my wife and raise up a child in my name. Like, what a weird concept, right? A couple people are laughing, like, wow. But in their minds, it was a totally normal and made sense kind of arrangement. Why is that? Well, because one of the reasons people got married is because they wanted to have a family. One of the reasons they wanted to have a family was because they had an inheritance that needed to be passed on to the next generation. And so in their minds, it wasn't like, I'm going to marry somebody so I'll be happy and I can live a fairy tale Cinderella dream. It's about survival, folks. It's about passing on your lineage. And not to say that there wasn't an affectionate side to marriage, but people looked at things very practically in those days, you might say, and kinsman redemption was a part of that. This word for redeemer is 13 times used in the book. And it has the idea of buying back the land of Naomi, as well as marrying Ruth and fathering a son to keep the family line alive. Boaz is acting as a kinsman redeemer. And technically, Ruth asked him to marry her, okay? Which is totally out of the cultural custom. But she was saying, I'm a widow, and I need someone to follow this pattern. So really, what does it show you? It shows you that Ruth has really become a part of this people. Your people are my people, your God, my God. I want to follow the custom so that my deceased husband will be able to have offspring in his name on this land. And that would have been the inheritance that David lived on. So David's out there, watching the sheep for his father. That land wouldn't have been his. Well, he wouldn't have been around if it wasn't for this story. Kinsman redeemer. Ruth 2, verse 20. Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed is he of the Lord who hath not left off his kindness of the living to the dead, to the living and to the dead. Naomi said, The man is near kin. Ruth 3, verse 9. I am Ruth, thine handmaid, spread therefore thine skirt over me, for thou art a near kinsman. You go, what in the world is that all about? It's about her coming under his protection and care. That is kind of the picture that is there. And there's another interesting concept that is in this book as well, and that is the covenant care of God for his people. In Ruth chapter 2, verse 12, it says, The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given unto thee of the Lord God of Israel. And here's the statement, under whose wings thou art come to trust. And if you look, this is a little statement, coming under the wings of the Lord. It's a picture that's used actually quite a bit in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms. I thought about going through a whole bunch of those, but I'm trying to get 2 books in the first, in our 1 hour here, so I didn't want to go to all these places. But I'd encourage you, look up that little idiom, under his wings. Just type the word wings into a search, and you got to do a little bit of work, but look at the situations where it's talking about someone coming under the wings of God's care. And you know what? It's a picture of someone coming under his covenantal care. And really, in this book, you could say that Boaz is like a picture of this. She is coming under Boaz's care, but ultimately she's coming under the care of the Lord because he has established this pattern in Israel for people in this situation. So, beautiful, beautiful story. All right, I'm going to stop there. I gave you an outline at the end of the book, end of the notes. Are there any questions or comments about those 2 books that go together there? Questions or comments? Judges, a little rough. Ruth, sweet story. Go ahead.
I think Ruth is so much of the Mosaic Law.
Yes.
Reference.
Yes.
And there's a caveat, if you take a Gentile bride, she has kind of deep program, hair, nails, cover hair,
Yeah.
kind of what Ruth did with Naomi.
Yeah.
So it just fits all that so well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Very, very interesting. And there are a lot of Old Testament laws that a lot of us don't like to read Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and we like to read the narrative passages and just kind of move past the laws because some of them are so different. They're hard for us to understand. But when you talk about some of the laws, especially in relation to widows and foreigners, you need to understand those laws in order to appreciate this story. And you see God's wisdom being displayed. He didn't just give people free handouts. He gave them a way that they could work and could care for themselves, and their dignity was preserved in that, and how they could become a part of his people. It's a really, really amazing story. So, yep. All right, well, we'll stop there, take a little break before we